A heartless millionaire bought a young virgin to bear him an heir, but he never imagined that she would awaken in him something he had never known: emotion. She arrived as part of a contract, but touched what was most human in him. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment saying where you are listening from. Augustus Blackwood had always believed that love was nothing more than a malfunction in human engineering. At 44, he stood as the most feared and respected figure in Britain's biotechnology sector, commanding an empire built upon precision, coldness, and an unwavering sense of absolute power. The glass towers of Blackwood Biotech pierced the London skyline like accusations against the heavens, each floor a testament to his relentless pursuit of perfection in a world he considered fundamentally flawed. Orphaned at 12 when his parents perished in a helicopter crash over the Scottish Highlands, Augustus had been raised by stern tutors, educated in the most unforgiving private schools, and shaped by decisions devoid of sentiment. The Blackwood estate in the Cotswolds had become his fortress, where emotion was as unwelcome as disease. He had learned early that the world showed no mercy to the vulnerable, and he had sworn never to allow anything or anyone to penetrate the armor he had so carefully constructed around his essence. In his meticulously ordered existence, everything was calculated, predicted, controlled. Everything except time itself, which now moved against him like a predator closing in for the kill. The document that would change everything lay spread across his mahogany desk in the penthouse office, its pages yellowed with age, but its words sharp as surgical instruments. His grandfather's will, that final act of manipulation from beyond the grave, contained a clause so precise it could have been written in blood. Lord Edmund Blackwood, the family patriarch whose obsession with legacy had consumed his final decades, had inserted an irrevocable condition into the inheritance. If Augustus failed to produce a legitimate heir before his 45th birthday, half of the family fortune would be transferred to an obscure environmental foundation in Cornwall. 11 months. That was all that remained of his deadline, and Augustus Blackwood was not a man accustomed to losing what he had built. Marriage was out of the question. It implied partnership, compromise, the messy entanglement of lives and emotions that would only serve to weaken his position. Relationships were distractions, temporary arrangements that inevitably led to disappointment and betrayal. What he needed was an heir, and he had decided to acquire one as he would any other strategic investment. A genetic project, nothing more. The team of physicians and lawyers he had assembled worked with the clinical efficiency of a military operation. They scoured profiles with criteria that would have made a eugenicist proud: optimal age for childbearing, impeccable family medical history, absence of hereditary diseases, psychological stability, ideal fertility markers. The candidates were reduced to data points, their humanity distilled into charts and graphs that could be analyzed and compared like stock portfolios. Among the dossiers spread across his conference table, one name emerged like a whisper in a silent room: Helena Moore, 21 years old, orphaned, raised in a convent school in the remote Yorkshire Dales, virgin, innocent, almost ethereal in her documented serenity. No vices recorded, no criminal connections, no family complications to navigate, pure in a sense that transcended the merely physical. Yet there was something mysterious about her file, incomplete records that spoke of a past shrouded in carefully maintained silence. The photograph clipped to her medical records showed a young woman with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths no camera could capture. Her hair fell in gentle waves around a face that was neither classically beautiful nor plain, but possessed of something far more dangerous than beauty: presence. She looked directly into the lens, with an expression that was neither shy nor bold but simply there, as if she existed in perfect harmony with whatever moment she occupied. Augustus stared at that photograph longer than his analytical nature could justify. There was something about Helena Moore that defied his systematic approach, something that whispered to parts of him he had thought permanently silenced. She seemed so utterly removed from his world of corporate warfare and calculated decisions that perhaps, paradoxically, she would fit into his plan perfectly. The choice was instinctive, and that troubled him more than he cared to admit. Augustus Blackwood did not make instinctive decisions. Yet something about this young woman, this ethereal creature from the Yorkshire wilderness, called to him in ways that his rational mind could not process or categorize. The contract was drawn up with his characteristic precision. Helena would reside for 1 year at Thornfield Manor, his ancestral estate nestled in the rolling hills outside Bath. She would receive the finest medical care available, luxury beyond anything her modest background could have prepared her for, and a substantial sum that would ensure her financial security for life upon successful completion of the pregnancy. There would be no intimacy beyond what was medically necessary for conception, no emotional entanglement, no illusions about the nature of their arrangement. It was perfect in its simplicity, clinical in its execution. Augustus had anticipated every variable, planned for every contingency. What he had not anticipated was the moment Helena Moore would step through the iron gates of Thornfield Manor and begin the systematic destruction of everything he thought he knew about himself. The November rain was falling in steady sheets when the black car wound its way up the gravel drive, its headlights cutting through the gloom like searching eyes. Augustus watched from his study window as the vehicle came to a stop beneath the stone portico, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that had become as natural as breathing. He had not intended to observe her arrival, had planned to maintain his distance and allow Mrs. Hartwell, the estate's housekeeper, to handle the mundane details of settlement. Yet here he stood, drawn by a curiosity he refused to acknowledge. The car door opened, and Helena Moore emerged into the rain like a figure stepping from a dream into reality. She was smaller than he had expected, more delicate, yet there was something in the way she moved that spoke of quiet strength. She did not hurry despite the weather, did not clutch at her modest coat or duck her head against the elements. Instead, she paused beneath the falling sky and looked up at the manor with an expression of wonder rather than intimidation. Thornfield Manor was a testament to centuries of Blackwood power, its Gothic revival architecture, designed to inspire awe and perhaps a measure of fear in those who approached its doors. The towering spires and elaborate stonework spoke of wealth accumulated across generations, of a family that had weathered wars and social upheavals while maintaining their position at the apex of British society. Most visitors found themselves diminished by the manor's grandeur, reduced to servants in the presence of such overwhelming display. Helena Moore stood in the rain and smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible from Augustus's distant vantage point, but it struck him with unexpected force. She was not diminished by Thornfield. She was not intimidated by its imposing facade or overwhelmed by the weight of its history. She simply accepted it as she seemed to accept everything else, with a serenity that suggested she carried her own sense of home within her, independent of external circumstances. Mrs. Hartwell appeared with an umbrella, fussing over Helena with the maternal efficiency that had made her indispensable to the manor's operation for over 2 decades. Augustus watched as the 2 women disappeared into the entrance hall, Helena's voice carrying on the wind in musical cadences that seemed to warm the very stones of the ancient building. He had expected to feel satisfaction at this moment, the completion of the first phase of his carefully orchestrated plan. Instead, he found himself standing at the window long after the car had departed, staring at the spot where Helena had stood in the rain, and wondering what it meant that a woman could smile at a building that had intimidated cabinet ministers and captains of industry. That first evening, Augustus had intended to maintain his routine, to treat Helena's presence as he would any other business arrangement, requiring minimal personal attention. He would remain in his study, review the quarterly reports that demanded his attention, perhaps conduct a video conference with the Tokyo office, where morning was breaking over another day of profit and loss. Instead, he found himself listening. Thornfield Manor was vast enough that its 3 main wings operated almost as separate dwellings, connected by corridors that could swallow sound and render entire sections silent as tombs. The East Wing housed his private quarters and study, a realm of masculine efficiency where every object served a purpose and every surface remained unmarked by sentiment. The Central Wing contained the grand public rooms, the dining hall and ballroom and library that existed in a state of perpetual readiness for entertainments that never came. And the West Wing, which had been sealed for over 2 decades, stood as a monument to secrets that Augustus had no intention of disturbing. Helena had been given quarters in the guest wing of the central section, rooms that commanded views of the rose garden and the lake beyond. They were beautiful rooms, decorated with antiques that had graced the manor for generations, but they maintained the same emotional temperature as the rest of the house. Thornfield did not easily yield its warmth to strangers. Yet as Augustus sat in his study that first night, he became aware of something that had been absent from the manor for longer than he cared to remember, the sound of life being lived without agenda or calculation. Helena moved through her rooms with a lightness that seemed to defy the manor's tendency towards silence. He could hear her footsteps on the ancient floorboards. Not the sharp click of heels that spoke of purpose and destination, but the soft whisper of bare feet exploring a new environment. She was walking without shoes, he realized, and the thought struck him as so unexpected that he found himself setting aside his papers to listen more intently. The sound traced a path from her bedroom to what he knew must be the sitting room, then out into the corridor where her footsteps grew fainter but did not disappear entirely. She was exploring, wandering the halls of Thornfield like a child discovering a new playground. Augustus rose from his desk and moved to the door of his study, pressing his ear against the carved wood like a schoolboy, eavesdropping on adult conversations. The sound of her movement had changed, become more purposeful. She was descending the main staircase now, her hand probably trailing along the polished banister that had guided Blackwood hands for over 3 centuries. Without conscious decision, he found himself opening the door and stepping into the corridor. The east wing connected to the central section through a gallery lined with portraits of his ancestors, stern-faced men and women who had built their legacy on the bones of those who had opposed them. Augustus had walked this gallery thousands of times, but tonight he moved like a spy in his own home, keeping to the shadows and listening for Helena's voice in the darkness. He found her in the library, a vast room lined with volumes that stretched from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings gleaming in the light of the fire that Mrs. Hartwell must have prepared. Helena stood before one of the tall windows that overlooked the gardens, her reflection ghosted in the rain-streaked glass. She had changed from her travel clothes into something simple and white that made her appear almost spectral in the firelight, a figure that might have stepped from one of the romantic novels that filled the lower shelves. She was reading aloud, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the silent room, not from any book, but from memory, reciting what sounded like poetry, in a cadence that transformed the ancient space into something altogether different. The words were familiar, fragments of verses he had studied in his youth, but had long since relegated to the dusty corners of his mind. "I have been half in love with easeful death," she spoke to the window and her own reflection, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain. Keats. She was reciting Keats to an empty library in a manor house where poetry had not been spoken for decades. Augustus found himself frozen in the doorway, afraid that any movement would break the spell and send her fleeing back to the safety of her assigned quarters. Helena turned from the window, and for a moment he thought she had seen him standing in the shadows, but her gaze passed over his hiding place without recognition, and he understood that she was lost in some internal landscape that had nothing to do with Thornfield Manor or the strange circumstances that had brought her here. She moved to the fireplace and settled into one of the leather chairs that flanked the hearth, pulling her feet beneath her in a gesture that was both childlike and ancient. From this position, Augustus could see her face clearly, and what he observed there challenged every assumption he had made about the woman he had chosen to bear his heir. Helena Moore was not the innocent waif her file had suggested. There was depth in her dark eyes, a kind of knowing that spoke of experiences far beyond her 21 years. She looked into the fire with the expression of someone who had already learned that life was not a fairy tale, yet who had somehow managed to retain a capacity for wonder that the world had not yet succeeded in destroying. She began to speak again, not poetry this time, but something that sounded like prayer, though the words were too soft for him to decipher. Augustus found himself leaning forward, straining to catch the meaning, and in that moment he understood that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world. He had chosen Helena Moore because she seemed safe, controllable, uncomplicated, a vessel for his genetic material, who would serve her purpose and disappear from his life with minimal disruption to his carefully maintained equilibrium. What he had not anticipated was the possibility that she would transform Thornfield simply by existing within its walls, that her presence would awaken echoes he had thought permanently silenced. As he stood watching her commune with the fire and the shadows, Augustus Blackwood felt the first crack appear in the armor he had spent decades perfecting. It was a small fissure, barely perceptible, but he recognized it with the instinct of a man who had built his empire on the ability to identify structural weaknesses before they became catastrophic failures. The woman sitting in his library, speaking to ghosts and flames with equal reverence, was going to be his undoing. He could feel it with the same certainty that had guided his most successful business ventures, that intuitive knowledge that transcended analysis and calculation. And for the first time in his adult life, Augustus Blackwood was not entirely certain he possessed the strength to prevent his own destruction. The days that followed Helena's arrival fell into a rhythm that Augustus found both soothing and deeply unsettling. Each morning, he would rise before dawn and make his way to the estate's private gymnasium, where he would punish his body with the same methodical precision he applied to every other aspect of his life. The physical exertion served a dual purpose: maintaining the disciplined physique that had become as much a part of his armor as his emotional detachment, and providing an outlet for the strange restlessness that had begun to plague his sleep. From the gymnasium's windows, he could see across the grounds to the guest wing, where Helena had made her temporary home. More often than he cared to admit, he found himself pausing between sets of exercises to watch for signs of movement behind her curtains. She was an early riser, he discovered, often appearing in the rose garden before the sun had fully crested the hills, moving among the dormant plants with a reverence that suggested she saw beauty where others might see only the skeletal remains of summer's glory. Mrs. Hartwell had reported that Helena was settling in well, though the housekeeper's descriptions painted a picture of a guest unlike any Thornfield had previously hosted. Helena refused the formal dining arrangements that had been prepared for her, preferring to take her meals in the smaller breakfast room where she could watch the gardens through the tall windows. She had politely declined the services of a lady's maid, insisting she was perfectly capable of caring for herself. Most surprisingly, she had requested access to the manor's extensive library and could often be found there well into the evening, reading by firelight with an intensity that suggested she was seeking something specific among the thousands of volumes. Augustus told himself that his interest in these details was purely practical. Helena was carrying out her part of their arrangement with admirable efficiency, maintaining her health and avoiding any behavior that might complicate their clinical relationship. Her contentment was essential to the success of their project, and monitoring her adjustment was simply good business sense. Yet he found himself altering his daily routines in ways that defied logical explanation. His morning walks through the estate, which had previously followed the same path for over a decade, now seemed to meander toward whichever part of the grounds Helena might be exploring. His evening reviews of business documents, once conducted in the strict isolation of his study, increasingly took place in the small sitting room adjacent to the library, where he could hear the soft rustle of pages turning and occasionally catch fragments of Helena's voice as she read aloud to herself. It was during one of these unacknowledged surveillance sessions that Augustus first noticed Helena's growing fascination with the sealed west wing of the manor. He had been reviewing quarterly projections from the Munich laboratory when movement in the garden caught his attention. Helena was walking along the gravel path that led around the manor's perimeter, but instead of continuing toward the lake, as had become her custom, she had stopped directly in front of the west wing's ground floor windows. The windows were covered from the inside, with heavy curtains that had not been drawn back for over 20 years. Their fabric faded and dust-laden. Ivy had begun to creep across the glass, creating patterns of shadow and light that gave the entire section of the building an air of deliberate abandonment. It was a part of Thornfield that Augustus had trained himself not to see, a collection of rooms that existed in his peripheral vision but never in his direct attention. Helena stood before those shrouded windows with the same contemplative expression she brought to her morning examinations of the rose garden. She placed her hand against the glass, her palm flat against the surface, as if she could sense the life that had once existed beyond the barrier. Augustus found himself rising from his desk and moving closer to his own window, drawn by the unexpected intimacy of her gesture. She remained there for perhaps 10 minutes, her head tilted as if she were listening for sounds that would never come. When she finally turned away, Augustus caught a glimpse of her expression in profile, and what he saw there sent an unexpected chill through his chest. Helena looked sad in a way that transcended her own circumstances, as if she were mourning for something she had never known but somehow understood she had lost. That evening, Augustus made a decision that violated every principle of the careful distance he had sworn to maintain. He would speak with Helena directly, not through the intermediary reports of Mrs. Hartwell or the clinical updates from the medical team that visited twice weekly. He would discover what had drawn her to the West Wing and ensure that her curiosity did not lead her into areas of the manor that were meant to remain undisturbed. He found her in the library, as had become predictable, though tonight she was not reading. Instead, she sat in the chair closest to the fire, her hands folded in her lap, and her gaze fixed on the flames with an intensity that suggested deep contemplation. She was dressed in a simple wool dress the color of winter sky, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her appear younger than her 21 years. "Miss Moore," he said from the doorway, his voice carrying more easily than he had intended in the silent room. Helena turned toward him without the startled movement he had expected. Instead, she regarded him with the same calm acceptance she seemed to bring to every new situation, as if his appearance in the library were as natural as the fire burning in the grate. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice carrying the soft cadences of her Yorkshire upbringing. "I was hoping we might have a chance to speak." The admission caught him off guard. In the week since her arrival, Helena had made no attempt to seek him out, had asked for nothing beyond what had already been provided. Her self-sufficiency had been both reassuring and, he was beginning to realize, somehow disappointing. "Indeed," he said, stepping into the library but maintaining a careful distance from her chair. "I trust you are finding your accommodation suitable." Helena smiled, and Augustus felt that same unexpected warmth that had struck him when he watched her emerge from the car in the rain. Her smiles were rare enough to feel like gifts, unguarded moments that revealed glimpses of the woman beneath the surface serenity. "Thornfield is magnificent," she said, her gaze sweeping around the library's towering shelves. "I've never seen so many books in one place. Mrs. Hartwell tells me some of these volumes are centuries old." "The library has been accumulated over many generations," Augustus replied, settling into the chair opposite hers with a stiffness that reflected his uncertainty about this unexpected conversation. "My ancestors believed that knowledge was the foundation of power." "And what do you believe?" Helena asked, the question delivered with such directness that Augustus found himself momentarily speechless. No one had asked him what he believed in longer than he could remember. In his world of corporate meetings and strategic planning, belief was considered a luxury that successful men could not afford. He dealt in facts, projections, measurable outcomes. Belief was for philosophers and poets, not for men who shaped the future through force of will and calculated risk. "I believe in results," he said finally, the answer feeling inadequate even as he spoke it. Helena nodded as if his response confirmed something she had already suspected. "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that you built your company from almost nothing after your parents died. That must have required tremendous belief in yourself." The mention of his parents' death was unexpected, a reference to trauma that Augustus had learned to treat as ancient history rather than formative experience. Most people who knew his story focused on his subsequent success, the remarkable transformation of grief into empire. Helena was the first person in years to acknowledge the pain that had preceded the triumph. "I learned early that the world does not pause for personal tragedy," he said, his voice carrying an edge that was meant to discourage further exploration of the subject. Instead of retreating, Helena leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight in ways that made them appear almost liquid. "No, it doesn't," she agreed. "But sometimes tragedy teaches us things about ourselves that we might never have discovered otherwise." There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience with loss, a quality of understanding that could only come from having walked through the fire herself. Augustus found himself studying her face more intently, searching for Clues about the experiences that had shaped her perspective on suffering and survival. "The West Wing," he said abruptly, changing the subject before their conversation could venture into territories he was not prepared to explore. "I noticed you seemed drawn to that part of the manor." If Helena was surprised by the sudden shift in topic, she showed no sign of it. Instead, she settled back in her chair and regarded him with the same direct gaze that had characterized their entire exchange. "It feels sad," she said simply, "like something terrible happened there, and the sadness never quite left." Augustus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied any reference to the sealed rooms, the reflexive closing off that had become as automatic as breathing. The West Wing was not a subject for casual conversation, not a topic that could be discussed with a virtual stranger who was only temporarily part of his carefully controlled world. "The West Wing has been closed for many years," he said, his tone carrying the finality that had ended countless business discussions. "It requires extensive renovations that have not yet been undertaken." Helena studied his face with an intensity that made Augustus feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. She was reading him, he realized, interpreting the subtle signs of tension and withdrawal with the same quiet attention she brought to everything else. "Of course," she said softly, and Augustus understood that she knew he was lying. The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Augustus found himself caught between the desire to escape this unexpected intimacy and a growing compulsion to discover what other insights this strange young woman might offer about his carefully guarded world. "So you mentioned that you were hoping we might speak," he said finally, returning to her earlier comment. "Was there something specific you wished to discuss?" Helena hesitated for the first time since their conversation began, her fingers worrying, the fabric of her dress in a gesture that revealed nervousness beneath her composed exterior. "I've been receiving letters," she said, the words emerging with obvious reluctance. "Anonymous letters. They've been slipped under my door in the early morning hours." Augustus felt every muscle in his body tense, his mind immediately jumping to security concerns and potential threats to both Helena and their arrangement. The idea that someone had been accessing the manor's interior without his knowledge, approaching Helena's quarters with unknown intentions, activated every protective instinct he had trained himself to suppress. "What sort of letters?" he asked, his voice sharp with authority. "Strange ones," Helena replied, reaching into the small bag she had placed beside her chair. She withdrew several envelopes, each one bearing her name in handwriting that appeared deliberately disguised. "They contain fragments of information about my parents' death, details that weren't in the official reports." She handed him the envelopes, and Augustus felt the first stirrings of something that might have been fear as he examined the careful handwriting. The paper was expensive, the kind of stationery that could be purchased at any number of exclusive shops throughout London. The postmarks were local, indicating that whoever was sending these messages was familiar with the area around Thornfield. "May I?" he asked, indicating the letters themselves. Helena nodded, and Augustus extracted the contents of the first envelope. The message was brief, written in the same disguised hand as the address. "Your parents were investigating Blackwood Biotech when they died. The fire was no accident." The words hit Augustus like physical blows, each syllable carrying implications that threatened to destroy the careful narrative he had constructed around Helena's selection for their arrangement. He opened the second letter with hands that had begun to tremble, despite his efforts to maintain control. "Your mother discovered documents linking Blackwood research to illegal genetic experiments. She was going to expose them." The third letter was even more damning. "Ask Augustus about Project Genesis. Ask him why your parents had to die." Augustus felt the room beginning to shift around him, reality tilting in ways that made it difficult to maintain his grip on the careful composure that had served as his shield for so many years. The letters were not random acts of malice or attempts at extortion. They were surgical strikes against the foundation of everything he had built, designed to destroy not just his relationship with Helena, but potentially his entire empire. More disturbing still was the growing realization that some of the information in the letters was accurate. Project Genesis had been one of Blackwood Biotech's most classified research initiatives, a genetic engineering program that had operated in legal gray areas during the early days of the company's expansion. The project had been shut down over a decade ago, its records sealed and its participants bound by confidentiality agreements that carried severe financial penalties for breach. But Helena's parents had never been connected to Project Genesis. James and Sarah Moore had been environmental activists, not industrial researchers. They had died in a house fire in a remote village in Yorkshire, victims of faulty electrical wiring in a cottage that should have been condemned years earlier. Their deaths had been tragic, but utterly unrelated to Augustus's business interests, hadn't they? Augustus found himself staring at Helena with new eyes, searching her face for signs of deception or manipulation. Had she orchestrated these letters herself, as part of some elaborate scheme to extract more than their agreed-upon compensation? Was her apparent innocence nothing more than a carefully constructed facade designed to lower his defenses? "You think I wrote them," Helena said quietly, her voice carrying a note of sadness that struck Augustus as either genuine or expertly performed. "The possibility had occurred to me," he admitted, his business instincts warring with something deeper that insisted Helena was incapable of such calculated deception. Helena rose from her chair and moved to the window, pressing her palm against the glass in the same gesture Augustus had observed her make in front of the sealed west wing. In the reflection, he could see tears gathering in her eyes, and the sight filled him with an unexpected urge to comfort her. "I was 7 years old when they died," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I spent 13 years in that convent school, wondering why God had taken them away from me. The sisters told me it was part of his plan, that their deaths had meaning I would understand someday. I never believed them." She turned from the window to face him directly, and Augustus saw in her expression a pain so raw and genuine that it cut through his suspicions like a blade through silk. "If these letters are true," she continued, "if my parents died because they discovered something terrible, then at least their deaths had purpose. At least they were trying to protect people from something dangerous." The anguish in her voice was unmistakable, and Augustus felt the last of his defenses beginning to crumble under the weight of her obvious sincerity. Helena had not written these letters. She was as much a victim of this anonymous campaign as he was, perhaps more so given the way it had reopened wounds that had never properly healed. "Helena," he began, then stopped, startled by his use of her first name. Throughout their brief interactions, he had maintained the formal distance of surnames, the professional barrier that kept their relationship clinical and impersonal. The shift to intimacy felt like crossing a line from which there would be no return. "I need to know," she said, stepping closer to him with a determination that transformed her from ethereal waif to formidable woman. "I need to know if my parents died because of something connected to your company. I need to know if you knew." Augustus looked into her dark eyes and felt the weight of 20 years' worth of carefully buried secrets pressing against his chest. Project Genesis had been his grandfather's initiative, a program that Augustus had inherited rather than created. He had shut it down as soon as he gained full control of the company, appalled by the ethical compromises that had been made in the name of scientific advancement. But had there been casualties along the way? Had there been people who had discovered too much and paid the ultimate price for their curiosity? "I don't know," he said finally, the admission feeling like a confession. "But I intend to find out." The promise hung between them like a bridge across an abyss, connecting them in ways that their clinical arrangement had never contemplated. Augustus realized that in making this commitment, he had fundamentally altered the nature of their relationship. They were no longer simply parties to a business transaction. They had become allies in a search for truth that could destroy them both. That night, Augustus lay awake in his massive four-poster bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Thornfield settling around him like a living thing. The manor had always been a sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the demands of the outside world and exist in perfect isolation. Now it felt compromised, invaded by questions and possibilities that threatened to undermine everything he had worked to build. Somewhere in the guest wing, Helena was probably lying awake as well, wrestling with revelations that had shattered her understanding of her own history. Augustus found himself imagining her in those moments of vulnerable solitude, wondering if she was afraid or angry, or simply overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they might discover together. The thought of her fear stirred something protective in him that he had not felt since he was 12 years old, and utterly powerless to save the people he loved from forces beyond his control. It was a dangerous emotion, one that could lead him to make decisions based on feeling rather than logic, but he found himself unable to dismiss it entirely. Tomorrow, he would begin his investigation into Project Genesis and its possible connection to the deaths of James and Sarah Moore. He would use every resource at his disposal, call in favors from contacts throughout the biotechnology industry, and dig as deeply as necessary to uncover the truth. But tonight, he allowed himself to acknowledge that his motivation had less to do with protecting his business interests than with easing the pain he had seen in Helena's eyes. And that realization, more than any anonymous letter or buried secret, represented the most dangerous development in a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond his control. In the darkness of his bedroom, Augustus Blackwood admitted to himself what he had been fighting since the moment Helena Moore stepped out of the rain. He was falling in love with her, and that love would either redeem him or destroy everything he had ever built. The investigation into Project Genesis began at dawn, when the rest of London still slept beneath a blanket of November fog. Augustus sat in his private study, surrounded by files that had not seen daylight for over a decade, their manila covers bearing the red stamps that marked them as classified beyond the reach of normal corporate oversight. The documents had been retrieved from a secure facility in Surrey, transported by courier in an armored vehicle that had arrived at Thornfield under cover of darkness. What Augustus discovered in those files would have destroyed a lesser man's faith in human nature entirely. Project Genesis had been his grandfather's obsession, a genetic research program that had operated with funding from sources that ranged from legitimate pharmaceutical companies to shadowy government agencies with interests that extended far beyond public health. The project's stated goal had been the development of enhanced human genetics, the creation of individuals with superior intelligence, physical capabilities, and resistance to disease. The reality had been far more sinister. The files contained records of experiments that violated every ethical standard of scientific research, test subjects who had been recruited from economically disadvantaged communities with promises of medical care and financial compensation, only to find themselves trapped in trials that lasted for years. Children who had been separated from their families and raised in institutional settings where their development could be monitored and manipulated. Most disturbing of all, evidence of what could only be described as selective breeding programs, where subjects were paired and monitored to produce offspring with desired genetic characteristics. Augustus felt physically ill as he read through page after page of clinical reports that reduced human beings to collections of data points. The language was sterile, scientific, but it could not disguise the magnitude of suffering that had been inflicted in the name of genetic advancement. Families destroyed, lives ruined, children who had never known normal human affection because they had been treated as laboratory specimens from birth. The project had been shut down abruptly in 2003, not because of ethical concerns, but because of what the files euphemistically described as security breaches. Several subjects had escaped from the research facilities and had begun talking to journalists about their experiences. Efforts to discredit their accounts had been largely successful, with the escapees dismissed as mentally unstable individuals seeking attention or financial gain. But some journalists had been persistent, and some investigators had begun asking uncomfortable questions about the sources of Project Genesis funding and the ultimate destination of its research data. It was in this context that Augustus first encountered the names James and Sarah Moore. The Moores had been environmental activists, but they had also been freelance journalists who specialized in investigating corporate misconduct. They had begun looking into Project Genesis after one of the escaped subjects had contacted them with evidence of illegal experiments. According to the files, they had managed to obtain copies of several classified documents before their investigation was terminated by their deaths in what had been reported as an accidental house fire. Augustus stared at the photographs of James and Sarah Moore that had been included in the intelligence reports. James had been a tall man with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair, his face bearing the lines of someone who had spent his life fighting for causes that others preferred to ignore. Sarah had been smaller, dark-haired like her daughter, with an intensity in her expression that suggested she possessed the same quiet strength that Augustus had observed in Helena. They had died because they had gotten too close to the truth about Project Genesis. And their daughter had been chosen to bear Augustus's child, not because of her genetic superiority or psychological stability, but because someone wanted to ensure that the Moore family's investigation would never be completed. The realization hit Augustus like a physical blow, forcing him to grip the edges of his desk to steady himself against the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. Helena had not been selected at random from a pool of suitable candidates. She had been specifically targeted because of who her parents were and what they had discovered before their deaths. Their arrangement was not a business transaction, but a trap, designed to place Helena under Augustus's control and ensure her silence about her parents' fate. But who had orchestrated this elaborate deception? Augustus's grandfather had died 5 years earlier, taking with him any direct knowledge of Project Genesis operations. The files contained references to other individuals who had been involved in the project's leadership, but most of those names belonged to people who were now dead or had disappeared entirely from public life. One name, however, appeared repeatedly throughout the documents: Daniel Barrett, described as the project's senior operations coordinator and Augustus's grandfather's most trusted advisor. Barrett had been responsible for recruitment of test subjects, management of security protocols, and what the files delicately termed containment of information breaches. Augustus remembered Daniel Barrett well. The man had been a fixture at Blackwood Biotech for over 3 decades, serving first as Lord Edmund's right hand and later as Augustus's own senior advisor as he consolidated control of the company. Barrett had been instrumental in helping Augustus navigate the complex transition following his grandfather's death, providing institutional knowledge and strategic guidance that had been invaluable during the company's most challenging period. Barrett had also been the person who had assembled the team responsible for selecting Helena Moore as the ideal candidate for Augustus's heir-producing arrangement. The betrayal was so complete, so perfectly executed, that Augustus felt a reluctant admiration for the man who had orchestrated it, even as rage began to build in his chest like molten metal. Barrett had spent years positioning himself as Augustus's most loyal advisor while secretly manipulating events to serve his own agenda. He had used Augustus's own desperation about the inheritance deadline to trap him in a situation that could destroy everything he had built. But what was Barrett's ultimate goal? If he wanted to damage Augustus's reputation or gain control of Blackwood Biotech, there were more direct approaches he could have taken. Why involve Helena at all? Why resurrect the ghosts of Project Genesis after so many years of successful concealment? The answer came to Augustus as he studied a photograph of Daniel Barrett that had been taken during a company function several years earlier. Barrett was standing in the background of the image, partially obscured by shadows, but his attention was clearly focused on Augustus, with an intensity that suggested something far more personal than professional loyalty. Barrett had been in love with Augustus's grandfather, not the professional devotion of a trusted employee, but the desperate, consuming love of a man who had built his entire identity around another person's approval and affection. When Lord Edmund had died, Barrett had lost not just his position of influence but his reason for existence. Helena was Barrett's revenge against the Blackwood family, his way of ensuring that the genetic line that had rejected him would be corrupted by the very people it had destroyed. By forcing Augustus to father a child with the daughter of Project Genesis victims, Barrett was guaranteeing that the next generation of Blackwoods would carry the blood of those whom the family had wronged. It was a revenge of almost poetic complexity, and Augustus found himself wondering how long Barrett had been planning this elaborate scheme. Had he been waiting since Lord Edmund's death for the perfect opportunity to strike? Had he deliberately delayed revealing the truth about Helena's parentage until Augustus was emotionally invested in their arrangement? The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his study interrupted Augustus's dark contemplations. He glanced at his watch and was startled to discover that the morning had passed entirely while he was absorbed in the files. It was past noon, and he had missed his usual breakfast with Helena in the small dining room overlooking the gardens. The realization that he had developed expectations about sharing meals with her struck Augustus as evidence of how profoundly his feelings had shifted without his conscious awareness. What had begun as clinical monitoring of her well-being had evolved into something that felt dangerously close to domestic intimacy. He found Helena in the conservatory, a glass-walled room that had been his mother's favorite retreat before her death. She was sitting on the wrought-iron bench that faced the garden, but her attention was focused on something in her lap rather than the view beyond the windows. As Augustus approached, he could see that she was holding a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and its cover worn smooth by countless hands. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice sharper than he had intended. Helena looked up at him with an expression that was both guilty and defiant, like a child caught exploring forbidden territory. "In the West Wing," she admitted. "One of the windows wasn't properly sealed. I managed to open it from the outside." Augustus felt his chest tighten with a combination of anger and fear. The West Wing was sealed for reasons that had nothing to do with renovation needs, and everything to do with preserving his sanity. Helena's unauthorized exploration of those rooms represented a violation of boundaries that he had spent 20 years reinforcing. "You had no right," he said, stepping closer to the bench with an authority that made most people retreat. "That part of the manor is off limits for very good reasons." Instead of backing down, Helena stood to face him directly, her dark eyes flashing with a spirit that Augustus had not seen before. "I had every right," she replied, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in her body. "I'm living in this house carrying your child, and someone is sending me letters about my dead parents. I think I deserve to know what secrets you're hiding." The mention of the pregnancy stopped Augustus cold. In all his focus on Project Genesis and Barrett's machinations, he had momentarily forgotten the most important aspect of their arrangement. Helena was already carrying his child, conceived through the clinical procedure they had both agreed to 3 weeks earlier. The fact that their relationship had evolved beyond its original parameters did not change the biological reality of what they had created together. "The child," he said, his voice softer now. "Are you well? Is everything progressing normally?" Helena's expression softened slightly at his obvious concern. "Dr. Whitmore says everything is perfect. The baby is healthy and developing exactly as expected." Relief flooded through Augustus with an intensity that surprised him. He had told himself that his interest in the pregnancy was purely practical, focused on securing his inheritance and continuing the Blackwood line. But the thought of anything threatening the life growing inside Helena filled him with a protectiveness that transcended business considerations. "Helena," he began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. Everything he had learned about Project Genesis and her parents' deaths had fundamentally altered his understanding of their situation. She deserved to know the truth about how she had been selected and why she was really at Thornfield, but the knowledge would destroy any possibility of the fragile connection that had been developing between them. "What is it?" she asked, studying his face with the same intuitive perception that always seemed to see straight through his carefully maintained facades. Augustus looked at the journal in her hands and made a decision that would have horrified his younger self. Instead of demanding that she return the book to its proper place and respect the boundaries he had established, he would tell her everything. About Project Genesis, about her parents, about Daniel Barrett's manipulation of their entire arrangement. She would hate him for it, probably leave Thornfield and take their child with her, but she deserved to know the truth. "Sit down," he said, settling beside her on the bench. "There are things about your parents' death that you need to know. Things about why you're really here." Helena's face went pale, but she remained seated, the journal clutched in her hands like a shield against whatever revelations were coming. "Tell me," she said simply. Augustus began with Project Genesis, explaining the scope of his grandfather's experiments and the suffering they had caused. He described his own horror upon discovering the full extent of the program and his efforts to shut it down and destroy its research data. Helena listened without interruption, her expression growing more stricken with each detail, but she did not look away or ask him to stop. When he reached the part about her parents' investigation and their subsequent deaths, Helena's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down, her face, not the gentle moisture he had seen before, but harsh, ugly sobs that seemed to tear from her chest with physical force. "They died for nothing," she whispered when she could finally speak. "They died trying to expose monsters, and the monsters won anyway." "No," Augustus said firmly, reaching out to take her hands in his. "They died fighting for something they believed in. They died trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Their deaths had meaning even if justice was delayed." Helena looked at their joined hands, then up into his face with an expression that was both vulnerable and accusing. "And you? Are you one of the monsters they were fighting?" The question cut through Augustus like a blade, forcing him to confront the fundamental uncertainty that had haunted him since he first learned of his grandfather's crimes. Had his success been built on the suffering of innocent people? Had his efforts to distance himself from Project Genesis been enough to absolve him of complicity in its crimes? "I don't know," he admitted, the words feeling like a confession. "I've spent years trying to make amends for what my grandfather did, but I can never bring back the people who were hurt. I can never undo the damage that was done in the Blackwood name." Helena studied his face for a long moment, as if she were weighing his sincerity against the magnitude of what he had revealed. Finally, she squeezed his hands gently, a gesture that felt like forgiveness even though he knew he had no right to expect it. "What about us?" she asked. "What about our arrangement? Was any of it real?" Augustus felt his heart constrict at the pain in her voice. This was the question he had been dreading, the moment when she would learn that even their connection had been orchestrated by forces beyond their control. "Daniel Barrett chose you specifically because of who your parents were," he said, forcing himself to meet her eyes as he delivered the final betrayal. "Everything about our arrangement was designed to trap us both. Your selection wasn't random. It was revenge." Helena's hands went limp in his, and for a moment Augustus thought she might faint. The color drained from her face entirely, leaving her looking ethereal and fragile in a way that made him want to gather her into his arms and shield her from the cruelty of the world. "So none of it was real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your interest in me, the way you've been looking at me lately, even this conversation, it's all just part of his plan." "No," Augustus said with a vehemence that surprised them both. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with Barrett or his schemes. What's happening between us, Helena? That's the only real thing in this entire nightmare." Helena looked at him with an expression that was both hopeful and deeply skeptical. "How can I believe that? How can I trust anything you say when everything else has been a lie?" Augustus released her hands and reached for the journal she had found in the West Wing. The leather cover was soft with age, and he could feel the weight of memories contained within its pages. He had not looked at this book for over 20 years, had sealed it away with everything else that reminded him of the person he had lost. "This belonged to my sister," he said, opening the journal to a random page where elegant handwriting covered the cream-colored paper. "Anna Blackwood. She died when she was 19, and I sealed the West Wing because I couldn't bear to be reminded of her every day." Helena's expression softened as she looked at the delicate script that filled the journal's pages. She had beautiful handwriting. What happened to her? Augustus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied thoughts of Anna, the younger sister who had been the only bright spot in his rigidly controlled childhood. Anna had been everything he was not, warm, spontaneous, filled with laughter and dreams that extended far beyond the confines of the Blackwood Empire. "She fell in love with someone my grandfather considered unsuitable," Augustus said, his voice growing rough with emotion. "A young man from the village who worked in the estate's gardens. When she refused to end the relationship, Lord Edmund had the young man arrested on fabricated charges and sent to prison." Helena's hand flew to her mouth in horror. "What did Anna do?" "She tried to help him escape. They were going to run away together, start a new life somewhere my grandfather's influence couldn't reach them. But something went wrong. There was an accident during the escape attempt. Anna drowned in the lake trying to save him when their boat capsized." The words came out in a rush, as if Augustus were trying to purge himself of a poison he had carried for too long. He had never spoken about Anna's death to anyone, had never allowed himself to grieve properly for the sister, whose love had been the only genuine warmth in his childhood. "That's why I don't believe in love," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I watched it destroy the only person who ever mattered to me. I've spent my entire adult life trying to ensure that I would never be vulnerable the way Anna was vulnerable." Helena was crying again, but these tears were different from the harsh sobs that had accompanied his revelations about her parents. These were gentle tears of sympathy and understanding, the kind that spoke of a heart that remained open despite having been wounded. "But you do believe in love," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face with fingers that trembled with emotion. "You wouldn't have fought so hard against it if you didn't believe in its power to transform people." Augustus caught her hand against his cheek, pressing his face into her palm with a desperation that felt like drowning. "Helena, I can't protect you from what's coming. Barrett won't stop with these letters. He'll escalate until he gets what he wants, and I don't even know what that is anymore." "Then we'll face it together," Helena said, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to fall. "Whatever Daniel Barrett has planned, whatever other secrets are hidden in this house, we'll deal with them together." Augustus looked into her dark eyes and saw something that took his breath away. Trust. Despite everything he had told her, despite the manipulation and lies that had brought them together, Helena was choosing to trust him. She was offering him something he had never expected to receive and had no idea how to deserve. "Helena," he said, his voice breaking on her name. "I know," she replied. And then she was kissing him. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if she were asking a question rather than making a statement. But when Augustus responded, pulling her closer with hands that shook with suppressed need, Helena's lips opened under his with a passion that set fire to every carefully constructed barrier he had built around his heart. They kissed like people who had been drowning and had suddenly found air, desperately and completely, with the kind of hunger that comes from denying desire until it becomes overwhelming. Augustus could taste salt from her tears and sweetness from her mouth, could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse where his fingers pressed against her throat. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Augustus rested his forehead against hers and tried to make sense of what had just happened. In the space of a single afternoon, his understanding of everything had been shattered and rebuilt around the woman in his arms. "This changes everything," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Helena agreed, her hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt, as if she were afraid he might disappear. "It does." Outside the conservatory windows, storm clouds were gathering over the gardens, promising rain that would wash the world clean. But inside the glass walls, surrounded by the ghosts of his family's sins and the promise of an uncertain future, Augustus Blackwood held Helena Moore and felt something he had never expected to experience: hope. The journal lay forgotten on the bench beside them, Anna's words about love and sacrifice waiting to be read by two people who were only beginning to understand that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Augustus knew that the real storm was only just beginning. But for the first time in his adult life, he was not facing the tempest alone. And perhaps with Helena's strength to complement his own, they might actually survive whatever Daniel Barrett had planned for them. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he held the woman who had unknowingly become the center of his universe, Augustus Blackwood felt something that might actually be peace. The storm that had been gathering throughout the afternoon broke just as Helena and Augustus made their way back to the main house, rain lashing against the conservatory windows with a violence that seemed to mirror the emotional upheaval of their revelations. They ran through the gardens hand in hand, Helena's laughter ringing out despite everything they had discussed, the sound so pure and unexpected that Augustus felt his chest tighten with something between joy and terror. Inside Thornfield's entrance hall, they stood dripping on the ancient marble floors, both breathing hard from their sprint through the rain. Helena's dark hair clung to her face in wet tendrils, and her simple dress had become translucent enough to reveal the subtle changes that pregnancy had already begun to work on her body. Augustus found himself staring at her with an intensity that had nothing to do with their recent confessions, and everything to do with the basic male need to claim and protect what had become precious to him. "We should get you into dry clothes," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You'll catch pneumonia standing here in wet things." Helena looked down at herself and seemed to notice for the first time how thoroughly soaked she had become. A blush spread across her cheeks, and Augustus felt desire hit him like a physical blow. This was not the clinical arrangement they had begun with, nor was it the friendship that had been developing between them over the past weeks. This was something entirely different, something that threatened to consume them both if they weren't careful. "Mrs. Hartwell will have prepared a bath," Helena said, but she made no move toward the stairs that would take her to her rooms. Instead, she stood in the entrance hall watching Augustus with an expression that seemed to be asking a question she didn't know how to voice. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of rain against windows and the subtle creaking of an old house settling around its inhabitants. Augustus knew he should step back, should maintain the physical distance that had allowed them to navigate their arrangement without complications. Everything had changed between them in the space of a single afternoon, but the realities of their situation remained the same. Helena was carrying his child as part of a business transaction that had been manipulated by forces beyond their control. Whatever feelings had developed between them, acting on those emotions would only complicate an already impossible situation. Yet when Helena moved closer to him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, despite her wet clothes, Augustus found himself powerless to retreat. She placed her hand against his chest, her palm flat over his heart, and he wondered if she could feel how rapidly it was beating. "Augustus," she said, his name a whisper that seemed to contain everything they had shared and everything they might become. He covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm more firmly against his chest, as if he could somehow transfer the truth of his feelings through simple contact. "Helena, we need to be careful. Everything that's happening between us, it could be exactly what Barrett wants. He could be counting on us forming an emotional attachment that will make us vulnerable to manipulation." Helena's dark eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or determination. "So what are you suggesting? That we ignore what we feel for each other, because it might be inconvenient for someone else's plans? That we live like strangers in the same house because Daniel Barrett might disapprove?" Augustus felt his resolve wavering under the force of her logic and the warmth of her touch. "I'm suggesting that we need to be smart about this. Barrett has been orchestrating events for months, possibly years. We can't afford to play into his hands by becoming reckless." "And I'm suggesting," Helena replied, stepping even closer, so that her body was almost pressed against his, "that the only way to defeat someone who's trying to manipulate our emotions is to be honest about what those emotions actually are." Before Augustus could respond, she rose on her toes and kissed him again, this time with a boldness that took his breath away. Her lips were soft and warm despite the chill of the rain, and when her tongue traced the seam of his mouth, Augustus felt his carefully maintained control shatter completely. He gathered her against him with hands that shook with suppressed need, lifting her slightly so that her feet barely touched the floor. Helena made a soft sound of surprise and pleasure that sent fire racing through his veins, and when she wrapped her arms around his neck, Augustus felt like a man who had been wandering in the desert and had suddenly found water. They kissed with the desperation of people who had been denying themselves something essential, and Augustus could taste the salt of earlier tears mixed with the sweetness that was uniquely Helena. She was everything he had not known he wanted, fierce and gentle, strong and vulnerable, challenging and comforting all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Augustus rested his forehead against hers and tried to remember why maintaining distance had seemed so important just moments before. "This is dangerous," he said, though his arms remained wrapped around her, as if he had no intention of letting her go. "Everything about our situation is dangerous," Helena replied, her fingers playing with the hair at the nape of his neck in a way that made it difficult for him to think clearly. "At least this particular danger is one we're choosing for ourselves." Augustus pulled back slightly so he could look into her face, searching for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. What he saw there was a woman who had spent her entire life being acted upon by forces beyond her control, who had finally found something she wanted to fight for. "Helena," he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the fears that were crowding his chest. He was 44 years old, a man who had built an empire through calculated risks and careful planning. She was 21, pregnant with his child, and surrounded by dangers she was only beginning to understand. The power imbalance between them was staggering, and the potential for him to hurt her, even unintentionally, was enormous. "I know what you're thinking," Helena said softly, her hand moving to cup his face with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. "You're thinking about the difference in our ages, about the fact that I'm carrying your child, about whether I can really make free choices given everything that's happened to me." Augustus nodded, surprised by her perceptiveness but not entirely surprised. Helena had shown from their first meeting that she possessed an intuitive understanding of people that went far beyond her years. "You're right to be concerned," she continued, her thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone, in a gesture that was both innocent and intimately knowing. "But Augustus, I've been making my own decisions since I was 7 years old. The nuns at the convent tried to protect me from the world, but they couldn't protect me from understanding that life is complicated and often unfair. I know exactly what I'm choosing when I choose you." The simple declaration hit Augustus with more force than any business negotiation or corporate takeover he had ever been involved in. Helena was offering him not just her body or her affection, but her trust, and he understood that it was a gift more valuable than anything his wealth could purchase. "Helena," he said again, and this time her name came out like a prayer. "Show me," she whispered against his lips. "Show me what it feels like to choose something for myself." Augustus felt the last of his resistance crumble under the weight of her request. With a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, he swept Helena into his arms and carried her toward the stairs that led to his private quarters in the East Wing. She didn't protest the destination, didn't suggest that they go to her rooms instead. She simply wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her face against his throat, her breath warm against his skin. The master suite occupied the entire top floor of the East Wing, its windows commanding views of the estate that stretched to the horizon. Augustus had designed the space as a retreat from the world, a place where he could exist without having to consider the needs or expectations of others. The rooms were decorated in dark wood and deep colors, masculine and uncompromising, reflecting the man who had created them. He set Helena down gently beside the massive four-poster bed that dominated the room, his hands lingering on her waist as if he were afraid she might disappear if he released her. In the lamplight, with her wet hair and flushed cheeks, she looked like something from a dream, too beautiful and ethereal to be real. "Are you certain?" he asked, the question emerging despite his determination not to give her any more chances to reconsider. Helena answered by reaching for the buttons of his shirt, her fingers working with a determination that suggested she had been thinking about this moment longer than he had realized. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to share. Augustus caught her hands gently, stilling their movement. "Helena, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about tonight. If we do this, if we cross this line, everything changes between us. There's no going back to the way things were." Helena looked up at him with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to explore. "I don't want to go back," she said simply. "I want to go forward with you, whatever that means." Augustus felt something break open in his chest at her words, a dam that had been holding back 20 years' worth of carefully controlled emotion. He had spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability, this exposure of the heart that could lead to devastating loss. But Helena was offering him something he had never expected to find, a chance at redemption, at becoming the kind of man who deserved to be loved by someone as remarkable as she was. "Then we go forward," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Together." What followed was unlike anything Augustus had ever experienced with another person. He had known physical intimacy before, of course, but it had always been transactional, carefully controlled encounters that satisfied physical needs without threatening emotional equilibrium. What he shared with Helena transcended the merely physical, becoming something that felt like a conversation conducted in touches and sighs, questions asked and answered with the movement of hands and mouths. Helena approached their lovemaking with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything else, exploring his body with a curiosity that was both innocent and deeply sensual. She traced the scars that marked his chest and shoulders, remnants of the physical discipline that had shaped his youth, and when she pressed her lips to each mark, as if she could heal old wounds with her tenderness, Augustus felt tears threaten for the first time since childhood. In return, he worshipped her body with a reverence that surprised them both, mapping every curve and hollow with hands that shook with the magnitude of what she was giving him. The changes that pregnancy had already begun to work on her body only increased her beauty in his eyes. The subtle roundness of her belly, a testament to the life they had created together. When they finally came together completely, it was with a tenderness that made their earlier clinical procedure seem like a violation of everything intimate and sacred. Helena cried out his name as her body accepted his, and Augustus felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of himself and what it meant to love another person completely. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the massive bed, Helena's head pillowed on Augustus's chest, while rain continued to lash the windows. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the kind of peace that comes after a long-fought battle has finally been won. Augustus stroked Helena's hair and listened to her breathing gradually slow as she drifted towards sleep. He should have been planning their next moves, analyzing the threats they faced and developing strategies for dealing with Daniel Barrett's escalating campaign against them. Instead, he found himself memorizing the weight of Helena's body against his, the scent of her hair, the sound of her breathing. For the first time in his adult life, Augustus Blackwood was living entirely in the present moment, and it was both terrifying and wonderful. The telephone in his study began ringing sometime after midnight, its shrill tone cutting through the peaceful quiet like a blade. Augustus considered ignoring it, unwilling to break the spell of intimacy that surrounded him and Helena, but the persistence of the caller suggested urgency that could not be dismissed. Careful not to wake Helena, Augustus slipped from the bed and pulled on a robe before making his way to his study. The caller identification showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about the late hour and timing made his skin crawl with apprehension. "Augustus Blackwood," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the dread that was building in his chest. "Augustus," came a voice he knew all too well. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Daniel Barrett's tone was smooth and cultured, the same voice that had advised Augustus through countless business decisions and personal crises. Hearing it now, knowing what he knew about Barrett's true motivations, made Augustus feel sick with a combination of rage and betrayal. "What do you want, Daniel?" Augustus asked, abandoning any pretense of politeness. Barrett chuckled, a sound that might have seemed warm to someone who didn't know about the man's capacity for manipulation. "Straight to the point, as always. I admire that about you, Augustus. Your grandfather had the same directness, though he was perhaps more willing to compromise when circumstances required it." "My grandfather was a monster," Augustus said flatly. "And apparently so are you." "Now that's hardly fair," Barrett replied, his tone suggesting he was genuinely hurt by the accusation. "Everything I've done has been motivated by love and loyalty to the Blackwood family. Admittedly, my methods have been somewhat unconventional, but the results speak for themselves." Augustus felt his grip tighten on the telephone receiver. "Your methods include murder and manipulation. You killed Helena's parents, didn't you? You orchestrated their deaths to silence their investigation." "The Moore's deaths were an unfortunate necessity," Barrett said, his voice losing some of its warmth. "They were threatening to expose research that could have saved thousands of lives. Sometimes, Augustus, difficult decisions must be made for the greater good." "The greater good?" Augustus repeated, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "You destroyed a family to protect a project that was torturing innocent people. You manipulated me into a relationship with their daughter as some kind of twisted revenge scheme. There's nothing good about any of this." Barrett was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. "I can see that the girl has gotten to you, Augustus. That's unfortunate, but not entirely unexpected. Your grandfather warned me that you might be susceptible to emotional manipulation." "What Helena and I have is not manipulation," Augustus said firmly. "It's the only real thing in this entire nightmare you've created." "Perhaps," Barrett conceded, "but reality has a way of intruding on even the most passionate romances. Tell me, Augustus, does your lovely Helena know about the medical procedures that were necessary to ensure her pregnancy?" Does she know about the genetic modifications that were made to the embryo to guarantee optimal development? Augustus felt the world tilt around him, Barrett's words hitting him like physical blows. What are you talking about? Barrett's chuckle was genuinely amused this time. Oh, my dear boy, did you really think we would leave something as important as your heir to the random chances of natural conception? The child Helena is carrying has been genetically enhanced using techniques developed during Project Genesis. Your son will be everything your grandfather dreamed of: superior intelligence, perfect health, enhanced physical capabilities. You're lying, Augustus said, though even as he spoke the words, he could feel the terrible logic of Barrett's revelation settling in his chest like poison. I'm afraid not, Barrett replied. The genetic modifications were introduced during the artificial insemination procedure. Helena was never conscious during the process, so she has no knowledge of what was done. But I assure you, the child she's carrying is no ordinary baby. Augustus thought about the clinical efficiency of the procedure that had resulted in Helena's pregnancy, the team of specialists that Barrett had assembled to oversee the process. He had assumed their expertise was simply to ensure optimal chances of conception. The possibility that they had been conducting genetic manipulation during the procedure had never occurred to him. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this to an innocent child? Because your grandfather's vision was correct, Augustus. Humanity stands on the brink of evolutionary advancement, and the Blackwood family has the opportunity to lead that advancement. Your son will be the first of a new generation, the beginning of a genetic line that will reshape the future of our species. Augustus felt bile rise in his throat as the full horror of Barrett's plan became clear. The man wasn't just seeking revenge against the Blackwood family. He was attempting to continue Lord Edmund's work, using Helena and their child as test subjects in his ongoing genetic experiments. You won't get away with this, Augustus said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. I'll expose everything. I'll make sure the world knows what you've done. I don't think you will, Barrett replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty, because exposing me means exposing what's been done to your child. Helena would never forgive you if she learned that the baby she's carrying has been genetically modified without her knowledge or consent. The scandal would destroy not just your relationship with her, but any chance your son might have of living a normal life. The trap was perfect in its cruelty. Barrett had ensured that Augustus could not seek justice without destroying the two people who had become most important to him. Helena would be devastated to learn that their child had been used as a genetic experiment, and the resulting publicity would mark the baby for life as a freak of science rather than a beloved son. What do you want? Augustus asked, though he already knew that whatever Barrett demanded, he would have no choice but to comply. I want you to continue exactly as you have been, Barrett said, his voice returning to its earlier warmth. Raise the child. Love Helena if you must, but remember that everything you hold dear exists only because I allow it to exist. Cross me, Augustus, and I will take it all away from you. The line went dead, leaving Augustus standing in his study with the telephone in his hand and the weight of impossible choices pressing down on his shoulders. Through the windows, he could see the first pale light of dawn beginning to creep across the estate, promising a new day that would bring no relief from the nightmare Barrett had created. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of footsteps on the stairs, and he turned to see Helena silhouetted in the doorway. She was wearing one of his shirts, the white cotton falling nearly to her knees, and her hair was tousled from sleep. She looked young and vulnerable and utterly trusting, and the sight of her nearly brought him to his knees. Augustus, she said, her voice soft with concern. Is everything all right? I heard you talking to someone. Augustus looked at the woman who had somehow become the center of his world, at the gentle curve of her belly, where their genetically modified child was growing, and felt the weight of secrets that threatened to destroy everything beautiful that had begun to bloom between them. Everything's fine, he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Just a business call that couldn't wait. Helena studied his face with the intuitive perception that always seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed facades. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, moving closer to him with obvious concern. Augustus managed a smile that felt like a grimace. Just tired, he said, reaching out to pull her into his arms. Come back to bed. The sun will be up soon, and I want to hold you while we watch it rise." Helena melted against him with a trust that made his chest ache, and Augustus held her close, while his mind raced through possible solutions to the impossible situation Barrett had created. There had to be a way to protect Helena and their child, while still finding justice for all the innocent people who had suffered because of the Blackwood family's crimes. But as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows of Thornfield Manor, Augustus Blackwood had never felt more trapped or more desperate to find a way out of the web of manipulation that threatened to destroy everyone he had learned to love. The war with Daniel Barrett had only just begun, and Augustus was no longer certain he possessed the weapons necessary to win it. The week that followed Barrett's midnight call passed in a haze of carefully maintained normalcy that felt like walking across thin ice. Augustus threw himself into the pretense of routine with desperate intensity, rising early for his morning runs through the estate, conducting video conferences with his international offices, reviewing quarterly reports with the same meticulous attention to detail that had built his empire. But beneath the surface of professional competence, he was drowning in the weight of secrets that threatened to destroy everything he had discovered he wanted to protect. Helena seemed to sense his internal struggle, though she attributed his tension to the ongoing investigation into her parents' deaths rather than the more devastating revelations Barrett had shared. She moved through Thornfield with a new confidence born of their deepening intimacy, her presence transforming the ancient manor from mausoleum to home in ways that Augustus found both comforting and terrifying. Every smile she gave him, every gentle touch, every moment of unguarded trust felt like a knife twisting in his chest as he struggled with the knowledge of what had been done to their child. The genetic modifications Barrett had described haunted Augustus's every waking moment. He found himself watching Helena's growing belly with a mixture of love and horror, wondering what kind of life their son would have if the truth ever came to light. The baby would be born with advantages that no natural child could possess, but those advantages had come at the cost of his humanity being reduced to a scientific experiment. How could Augustus live with himself knowing that he had allowed their child to become part of Barrett's continuing legacy of genetic manipulation? Yet how could he destroy Helena's joy in their pregnancy by revealing the truth? She had begun talking to the baby during her morning walks through the garden, her hands resting protectively over her belly as she shared her hopes and dreams for their son's future. She had started planning the nursery, discussing with Mrs. Hartwell which room in the manor would receive the best morning light and whether the ancient windows would need to be replaced to ensure proper ventilation. She radiated the quiet contentment of a woman who had found her purpose, and Augustus could not bear the thought of shattering that peace with revelations that would serve no constructive purpose. The letters from Barrett's anonymous accomplice had stopped arriving, but their absence felt more ominous than their presence. Augustus knew that Barrett was planning something, waiting for the optimal moment to strike at the fragile happiness they had built together. The silence felt like the pause before an avalanche, pregnant with inevitable destruction. It was Helena who broke the deadlock, though not in any way Augustus could have anticipated. He found her in the West Wing on a grey Thursday morning, standing in what had once been Anna's bedroom with Anna's journal open in her hands. The room had been sealed for over 20 years, its windows covered, and its furniture draped in white sheets that gave it the appearance of a shrine to lost innocence. Helena had somehow managed to force the locked door, and now she stood surrounded by the ghosts of his past, reading his sister's most private thoughts. "You shouldn't be here," Augustus said from the doorway, his voice carrying an authority that usually sent subordinates scurrying for cover. Helena looked up from the journal with tears streaming down her face, but her expression was defiant rather than apologetic. "She was pregnant," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Anna was pregnant when she died." The words hit Augustus like a physical blow, forcing him to grip the doorframe for support. In all the years since Anna's death, he had never suspected that his sister's tragic love affair had resulted in pregnancy. The knowledge that she had been carrying a child when she drowned in the lake trying to save her lover added another layer of horror to a tragedy that had already shaped the trajectory of his entire life. "That's impossible," he said. though even as he spoke the words, he could feel the terrible logic of Helena's discovery settling in his chest. Helena turned the journal toward him, her finger pointing to a passage written in Anna's delicate script. She writes about morning sickness, about being afraid to tell your grandfather, because she knew he would force her to end the pregnancy. She was planning to tell Thomas the night they tried to escape together. Augustus moved into the room like a man walking toward his own execution, his feet carrying him forward despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. Anna's bedroom looked exactly as it had the day she died, frozen in time like a museum exhibit, dedicated to the brief life of a young woman who had dared to love against her family's wishes. Her clothes still hung in the wardrobe, her books still lined the shelves, her hairbrush still lay on the dressing table, where she had placed it on her final morning. Helena handed him the journal, and Augustus read his sister's words with a growing sense of horror and recognition. Anna had written about her fear of their grandfather's reaction, her desperate hope that love would somehow find a way to overcome the obstacles that stood between her and happiness. She had written about dreams of raising her child in a cottage by the sea, far from the suffocating influence of the Blackwood legacy. Most devastating of all, Anna had written about her growing certainty that their grandfather would never allow her child to be born free of his influence. She had suspected that Lord Edmund would try to use her pregnancy as another opportunity to continue his genetic research, to study the offspring of selective breeding programs that had been designed to produce superior human specimens. She knew, Helena said softly, her hand moving to rest protectively over her own belly. Somehow she knew what your grandfather was capable of, and she was trying to protect her baby from becoming part of his experiments. Augustus felt the world shift around him as the full implications of Anna's journal became clear. His sister had not died in a simple accident during an escape attempt. She had died trying to save her unborn child from becoming a victim of the same genetic manipulation programs that had now been visited upon Augustus's own son. The parallel was so perfect, so devastatingly complete, that Augustus wondered if Barrett had somehow orchestrated events to mirror Anna's tragedy. Was Helena destined to suffer the same fate as his sister? Was their child doomed to become another casualty in a war between love and scientific ambition that had been raging in the Blackwood family for generations? Augustus, Helena said, her voice gentle but insistent, there's something else you need to see. She led him to Anna's dressing table, where she had discovered a hidden compartment behind the mirror. Inside was a collection of documents that Anna had apparently hidden shortly before her death. Medical records, research notes, and photographs that painted a picture of Project Genesis in its earliest stages. The photographs were the most damning evidence Augustus had ever seen of his grandfather's crimes. They showed children who had clearly been subjected to genetic experimentation, their bodies displaying the kinds of abnormal development that could only result from deliberate manipulation of human DNA. Some of the children appeared to possess enhanced physical capabilities, while others showed signs of accelerated intellectual development that bordered on the supernatural. Most disturbing of all were the photographs of children who had not survived the experimental process. Their small bodies lay on examination tables like broken dolls, casualties of a scientific ambition that had valued genetic advancement over human life. Anna was documenting everything, Helena said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was building a case against your grandfather, collecting evidence that could have exposed Project Genesis decades before my parents ever began their investigation. Augustus stared at the photographs with growing horror, understanding that his sister had died not just for love, but because she had posed a direct threat to Lord Edmund's most important work. Anna had been planning to expose Project Genesis from within the family itself, using her position as the patriarch's beloved granddaughter to bring down the entire program. She was braver than I ever knew, he said, his voice thick with emotion and regret. Helena moved closer to him, her hand finding his, with the sure instinct of a woman who understood that comfort was sometimes more important than words. She was trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, just like my parents were trying to do. The connection between Anna's death and the Moore's murder 20 years later was undeniable. Both had died because they had discovered the truth about Blackwood family crimes, and both had been silenced before they could bring that truth to light. The cycle of violence and cover-up had continued for decades, claiming innocent lives in service of protecting secrets that should never have existed in the first place. Augustus felt the weight of generational guilt settling on his shoulders, like a mantle he could never remove. The Blackwood name was synonymous with scientific advancement and medical breakthroughs that had saved countless lives, but it was also built on a foundation of suffering and exploitation that stretched back to his grandfather's earliest experiments. "Helena," he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the confession that Barrett's midnight call had made inevitable. She deserved to know the truth about what had been done to their child, but the knowledge would destroy the peace she had found in their growing family. "I know," she said softly, her dark eyes meeting his with a directness that took his breath away. "You know what?" Augustus asked, though something in her expression suggested that she had already discovered whatever terrible secret he was struggling to share. Helena reached into the hidden compartment and withdrew one final document that she had not yet shown him. It was a medical report dated just 3 weeks earlier, bearing the letterhead of Dr. Whitmore's private clinic in London. Augustus recognized the physician's name as the specialist who had been overseeing Helena's prenatal care since the beginning of her pregnancy. "Dr. Whitmore's nurse called yesterday while you were in London," Helena said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "There had been some confusion about my medical records, and she wanted to verify information about the genetic screening that had supposedly been conducted before my pregnancy." Augustus felt his blood turn to ice as Helena continued, her words falling like hammer blows against whatever remained of his composure. The problem was, Dr. Whitmore had no record of conducting any genetic screening. In fact, according to his notes, genetic screening would have been impossible, given the accelerated timeline of the artificial insemination procedure. Unless, of course, genetic modifications had been introduced during the procedure itself. The document in Helena's hands contained a detailed analysis of the blood work that had been conducted during her routine prenatal visits. Dr. Whitmore had detected anomalies in the fetal development that could only be explained by deliberate genetic manipulation, modifications that had been introduced at the cellular level during conception. "Our baby," Helena said, her voice breaking slightly on the words, "our son has been genetically enhanced without our knowledge or consent. Someone used him as a test subject for continuing genetic experiments, and you've known about it for days." Augustus felt the accusation hit him like a physical blow, though he knew he deserved far worse than Helena's quiet disappointment. He had allowed Barrett to manipulate him into silence, had chosen to protect his own emotional comfort over Helena's right to know the truth about what had been done to their child. "Helena, I'm sorry," he began, but she cut him off with a gesture that was both gentle and final. "I'm not angry with you for not telling me," she said, surprising him with her composure. "I understand why you wanted to protect me from this knowledge, but Augustus, I need you to understand something about me that you seem to have forgotten." She moved to stand directly in front of him, her hands coming up to frame his face with a tenderness that made his throat tighten with emotion. "I am not a fragile flower that will wilt at the first sign of adversity," she said, her voice carrying a strength that reminded him of steel wrapped in silk. "I was raised by nuns who taught me that suffering is often the price we pay for understanding, and I have been fighting for my survival since I was 7 years old. I don't need you to shield me from the truth. I need you to trust me enough to face it together." Augustus felt tears threaten for the second time since childhood, overwhelmed by the grace with which Helena was handling revelations that would have broken lesser people. She was not retreating into victimhood or demanding comfort he could not provide. Instead, she was taking control of their situation with a quiet authority that made him understand why Barrett had chosen her specifically for his revenge scheme. Helena Moore was not just the daughter of people who had died fighting the Blackwood legacy of genetic experimentation. She was a fighter in her own right, someone who possessed the courage and intelligence necessary to finish what her parents and Anna had begun decades earlier. "What do you want to do?" Augustus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Helena smiled, and for the first time since Barrett's midnight call, Augustus felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. "I want to destroy him," she said simply. "I want to expose Daniel Barrett and everything he's done, and I want to make sure that no other children will ever be subjected to the kind of genetic manipulation that was performed on our son." "Helena, you don't understand what you're suggesting," Augustus said, though even as he spoke the words, he could feel his own resolve strengthening in response to her determination. "Barrett has spent decades building a network of influence and power. He has evidence that could destroy both of us, and he's already demonstrated that he's willing to kill to protect his secrets." "Then we'll have to be smarter than he is," Helena replied, her dark eyes flashing with a spirit that reminded Augustus of his sister's courage in the face of impossible odds. "We have advantages that Anna didn't have, that my parents didn't have. We have access to resources they could never have imagined, and we have each other." Augustus looked at the woman who had somehow become his partner in love and war, and felt the last of his resistance crumble under the force of her conviction. Helena was right. They could not allow Barrett to continue his manipulation indefinitely, could not raise their child in the shadow of secrets that would eventually destroy their family, just as they had destroyed so many others. "All right," he said, the words feeling like a declaration of war. "We fight back. But Helena, you need to understand that once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Barrett will escalate his attacks, and there's no guarantee that we'll be able to protect ourselves or our child from the consequences." Helena's smile widened, and Augustus saw in her expression the same fearless determination that had driven Anna to document Project Genesis, despite the personal risk. The same courage that had motivated the Moores to investigate genetic crimes, even when they knew they were walking into danger. "I've been living with consequences my entire life," she said, her hand moving to rest over her belly, where their genetically modified son was growing. "So at least now I get to choose which consequences I'm willing to accept." They spent the rest of the morning in Anna's room, surrounded by evidence of crimes that stretched back decades, planning a campaign that would either bring justice to the victims of Blackwood family experiments or destroy everything they had built together. Helena proved to have an intuitive understanding of strategy that complemented Augustus's business experience, and together they began constructing a plan that would use Barrett's own methods against him. The first step would be gathering additional evidence of Barrett's involvement in both Project Genesis and the more recent genetic manipulation of their child. Augustus had contacts throughout the biotechnology industry who could provide independent verification of the procedures that had been performed during Helena's artificial insemination. Helena, meanwhile, would use her access to Dr. Whitmore to document the specific genetic modifications that had been introduced, creating a medical record that could serve as evidence in any future legal proceedings. The second step would be identifying and protecting other potential victims of Barrett's continuing experiments. If Barrett had been willing to manipulate their child's genetics, he had almost certainly been conducting similar procedures on other unsuspecting subjects. Finding those victims and documenting their experiences would be essential to building a case that could not be dismissed as personal vendetta. The final step would be the most dangerous, confronting Barrett directly and forcing him to reveal the full scope of his operations. This would require careful timing and perfect execution, as Barrett would undoubtedly have contingency plans designed to protect himself if his activities were ever exposed. As they worked through the details of their plan, Augustus found himself marveling at the woman Helena had revealed herself to be. The ethereal waif who had stepped out of the rain 6 weeks earlier had transformed into a formidable opponent who possessed both the intelligence to understand complex scientific concepts and the moral clarity to recognize injustice when she encountered it. More than that, Helena had somehow managed to retain her capacity for love and trust, despite everything she had learned about the manipulation that had brought them together. She looked at Augustus not as a representative of the family that had destroyed her parents, but as a partner who could help her achieve the justice that had been denied for too long. "Augustus," she said as they prepared to leave Anna's room, "there's one more thing we need to discuss." He turned to face her, noting the slight hesitation in her voice that suggested she was about to broach a subject that made her uncomfortable. "Our son," she continued, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "Regardless of what was done to him during conception, regardless of the genetic modifications that were introduced without our consent, he's still our child. I need to know that you won't love him any less because of what Barrett did to him." The question cut straight to Augustus's deepest fears about their situation. How could he look at his son without seeing evidence of Barrett's manipulation? How could he love a child whose very existence was a testament to the continuing legacy of Blackwood family crimes? But as he looked at Helena, at the fierce protectiveness in her eyes and the gentle curve of her body where their baby was growing, Augustus felt something shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a father. Their son had not chosen to be part of Barrett's experiments, any more than Helena had chosen to lose her parents, or Augustus had chosen to inherit his grandfather's crimes. The baby was as much a victim of Barrett's manipulation as they were, and he deserved to be loved and protected accordingly. "Helena," Augustus said, moving closer to her and placing his hands over hers where they rested on her belly, "our son is going to be extraordinary, not because of any genetic modifications, but because he'll be raised by a mother who would move mountains to protect him, and a father who's finally learned what it means to fight for something more important than himself." Helena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling as she leaned forward to kiss him with a passion that tasted like hope and determination, and the promise of a future worth fighting for. Outside Anna's window, storm clouds were gathering over the estate, promising another night of rain and wind that would test the ancient bones of Thornfield Manor. But inside the sealed room where his sister had once planned her own rebellion against family tyranny, Augustus Blackwood held the woman he loved and felt ready to face whatever tempest Barrett might unleash against them. The war for their family's future was about to begin in earnest, and Augustus was no longer afraid of the outcome. With Helena at his side, he felt capable of conquering any enemy, surviving any storm, and building the kind of love that could withstand even the darkest legacies of the past. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Augustus knew that Barrett would not wait much longer to make his next move. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Augustus felt ready for whatever was coming. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for if necessary, and no amount of manipulation or threat could take that away from him. The final confrontation was approaching, and Augustus Blackwood was no longer the isolated, emotionally armored man who had agreed to Barrett's arrangement 6 weeks earlier. He was Helena's partner, their child's father, and a man who had finally learned that some things were more important than protecting himself from the possibility of loss. Barrett had created a monster in trying to manipulate their love for his own purposes. But the monster he had created was not the genetically modified child growing in Helena's womb. It was the combined fury of two people who had discovered that they were willing to risk everything to protect their family and ensure that no other innocents would suffer as they had suffered. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, Augustus and Helena would be the predators rather than the prey. The trap was sprung 3 days later, with the precision and inevitability of a predator that had been stalking its prey for months. Augustus should have seen it coming, should have anticipated that Barrett would never allow them the luxury of planning their counterattack in peace. But love had made him careless in ways that his younger, more ruthless self would never have tolerated, and by the time he recognized the signs of Barrett's final gambit, it was already too late to prevent the catastrophe that was bearing down on them like an avalanche. It began with a phone call from Dr. Whitmore's clinic, delivered to Helena, while Augustus was in London, meeting with contacts who had promised to provide independent verification of the genetic modifications performed on their child. The nurse's voice was professionally calm, but Helena could hear the underlying urgency that suggested something had gone terribly wrong. "Miss Moore, I'm afraid there's been a complication with your pregnancy that requires immediate attention," the nurse said, her words carefully measured to avoid causing panic while conveying the seriousness of the situation. "Dr. Whitmore needs to see you this afternoon for emergency testing. The complications we've detected could pose a significant risk to both you and your baby if they're not addressed immediately." Helena felt her blood turn to ice as the nurse continued, describing symptoms that Helena had not experienced, but which apparently showed up clearly in the blood work from her most recent prenatal visit. Elevated protein levels indicating possible preeclampsia, signs of placental deterioration that could lead to premature birth, genetic instabilities in the fetal development that might require immediate intervention to prevent catastrophic complications. "I don't understand," Helena said, her hand moving instinctively to her belly, where the baby was moving with his usual vigorous energy. "I feel fine. The baby is active and healthy. Are you certain there isn't some mistake with the test results?" "I'm afraid the results are quite clear," the nurse replied, her tone suggesting that Helena's protests were exactly what she had expected from a patient in denial about serious medical complications. "Miss Moore, I cannot stress strongly enough how important it is that you come in this afternoon. Dr. Whitmore has cleared his schedule to accommodate you. Can't we have a surgical team standing by in case immediate intervention becomes necessary?" Helena agreed to the appointment because she had no choice, but something about the nurse's tone triggered every survival instinct she had developed during her years of navigating a world that seemed determined to take away everything she loved. The timing was too convenient, the symptoms too perfectly aligned with the kind of medical emergency that would force her to make desperate decisions without the luxury of careful consideration. She tried calling Augustus, but his phone went directly to voicemail, and his assistant at Blackwood Biotech informed her that he was in meetings that could not be interrupted except for genuine emergencies. Helena considered whether her situation qualified as a genuine emergency, but decided that she needed more information before she escalated her concerns to the level that would pull Augustus away from potentially crucial negotiations with his scientific contacts. Instead, she called Mrs. Hartwell and arranged for transportation to Dr. Whitmore's clinic in London, telling the housekeeper that she had a routine appointment that might run longer than usual. Something held her back from sharing the details of the alleged complications, an instinct that warned her against revealing too much information until she better understood what was really happening to her body and her baby. The drive to London took place through a landscape that seemed to reflect Helena's growing sense of unease. The November afternoon was grey and cold, with fog rolling in from the Thames to shroud the city, in an atmosphere that felt both ethereal and ominous. Helena found herself thinking about Anna's journal, about the young woman's growing certainty that her grandfather would never allow her child to be born free of his influence. The parallel to her own situation was too obvious to ignore, and Helena wondered if she was walking into the same kind of trap that had ultimately claimed Anna's life. Dr. Whitmore's clinic occupied an elegant Georgian building in Harley Street, its discreet brass plaque and pristine facade speaking of the kind of exclusive medical care that catered to London's wealthy elite. Helena had been coming here for her prenatal visits since the beginning of her pregnancy, and she had always found the atmosphere professional and reassuring. Today, however, something felt different about the clinic's usually welcoming environment. The waiting room was empty except for Helena, unusual for an afternoon that should have been busy with patients seeking the kind of specialized care that commanded premium fees. The receptionist, who normally greeted Helena with warm familiarity, was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a younger woman who seemed nervous and avoided making direct eye contact as she processed Helena's arrival. "Miss Moore," the new receptionist said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that suggested she was either very new to her position or dealing with circumstances that made her uncomfortable. "Dr. Whitmore is ready to see you immediately. Please follow me." Helena was escorted not to the familiar examination room where she had received her previous prenatal care, but to a different wing of the clinic that she had never seen before. The corridors here were wider and more sterile, designed for procedures that required more space and equipment than routine examinations. Helena's unease intensified as she realized that she was being taken to what appeared to be a surgical suite, complete with monitors and equipment that looked more appropriate for emergency operations than prenatal consultations. Dr. Whitmore was waiting for her in the surgical suite, but he was not alone. Standing beside him was a man Helena recognized from photographs in Augustus's files, Daniel Barrett, looking exactly as imposing and manipulative as she had imagined from Augustus's descriptions. Barrett's presence in the room transformed Helena's growing suspicion into absolute certainty that she had walked into an elaborate trap. "Miss Moore," Dr. Whitmore said, his usually warm bedside manner replaced by a clinical detachment that made Helena's skin crawl. Thank you for coming so promptly. As I explained over the phone, we've detected some complications that require immediate attention. What kind of complications? Helena asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear that was beginning to race through her veins like poison. It was Barrett who answered, his cultured voice carrying the same smooth authority that had manipulated Augustus for decades. The kind of complications that arise when genetic modifications begin to destabilize during fetal development, he said, moving closer to Helena with the confidence of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. The enhancements that were introduced during your artificial insemination were experimental. Miss Moore, we're discovering that some of the modifications may not be compatible with normal human pregnancy. Helena felt the room spin around her as Barrett continued, his words falling like hammer blows against her understanding of her own body and her baby's welfare. The genetic instabilities we've detected could result in catastrophic complications during birth, Barrett said, his tone suggesting that he was delivering tragic news rather than threats. Massive hemorrhaging, organ failure, possible death for both mother and child. Unless, of course, we take immediate action to stabilize the modifications and ensure that your pregnancy proceeds safely. What kind of action? Helena asked, though she suspected she already knew what Barrett was proposing. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward with a medical consent form that looked as though it had been prepared well in advance of their conversation. We need to perform additional genetic modifications to counteract the instabilities that have developed, he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth Helena remembered from their previous interactions. The procedure is experimental, but it's the only way to ensure that your baby survives to term. Helena looked at the consent form and saw exactly what she had expected. Authorization for procedures that would give Barrett complete control over her pregnancy and their child's genetic development. By signing the document, she would be consenting not just to emergency medical intervention, but to becoming a willing participant in the continuation of Project Genesis. And if I refuse? She asked, though Barrett's smile suggested that refusal was not really an option. Then you'll almost certainly lose the baby within the next few days, Barrett replied, his tone suggesting genuine regret for circumstances that were entirely beyond his control. The genetic instabilities are accelerating. Miss Moore, every hour we delay increases the risk of catastrophic complications. Helena felt trapped in a nightmare that seemed designed to replay the worst moments of her family's history. Just as her parents had been silenced when they got too close to the truth about Project Genesis, just as Anna had died trying to protect her unborn child from Lord Edmund's experiments, Helena was being forced to choose between her baby's life and her own autonomy. But unlike her parents and Anna, Helena was not facing this crisis alone. She had Augustus's love and support, even if he was currently unaware of the immediate danger she was facing. More importantly, she had learned from their example that sometimes the most important victories required sacrifices that seemed impossible to make. I need to call Augustus, Helena said, reaching for her phone with hands that she forced to remain steady. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Barrett said, producing a device that Helena recognized as a signal jammer. Mr. Blackwood is currently in meetings that cannot be interrupted, and medical emergencies. Require immediate decisions rather than lengthy consultations. Helena felt the last of her illusions about the situation crumble as she realized that Barrett had orchestrated every aspect of this confrontation with the same methodical precision he had brought to decades of genetic manipulation. Augustus's meetings in London had probably been arranged by Barrett to ensure that Helena would be isolated and vulnerable when the medical crisis was manufactured. You're lying about the complications, Helena said, the accusation emerging with more confidence than she actually felt. There's nothing wrong with my pregnancy. You fabricated this entire medical emergency to force me into consenting to additional genetic experiments. Barrett's expression shifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of the calculating intelligence that had made him so effective at manipulating people and situations to serve his purposes. Perhaps, he admitted, his tone suggesting that Helena's perceptiveness was both impressive and ultimately irrelevant. But can you really afford to take that risk? If there's even a small possibility that the complications are real, that your baby's life is genuinely in danger? Can you live with yourself if you choose to gamble with his survival? The question cut straight to Helena's deepest fears about motherhood and her responsibility to protect the life growing inside her. Barrett had constructed the perfect psychological trap, one that used her love for her child as a weapon against her own better judgment. Even if she suspected that the medical emergency was fabricated, the stakes were too high to allow her to call Barrett's bluff. Helena looked around the surgical suite, taking note of the exits and the positioning of Barrett and Dr. Whitmore relative to her own location. She was outnumbered and isolated, trapped in a situation where any attempt to escape would require her to overcome two men who were obviously prepared for resistance. But Helena Moore had not survived 7 years in a convent orphanage and 14 years of fighting for her independence by accepting defeat when the odds seemed impossible. "If I sign your consent form," she said, moving closer to the examination table in a way that she hoped appeared cooperative rather than strategic, "what guarantee do I have that you'll actually honor the terms of our original arrangement? How do I know that you won't simply continue experimenting on my child for as long as it serves your purposes?" Barrett smiled, and Helena saw in his expression the same cold calculation that had motivated decades of genetic manipulation and murder. "You don't," he said simply. "But Miss Moore, you're hardly in a position to negotiate terms. Sign the consent form, and you and your baby have a chance at survival. Refuse, and I guarantee that you'll both be dead within the week." The threat was delivered with such casual certainty that Helena felt ice settle in her chest. Barrett was not bluffing about his willingness to kill her if she failed to cooperate. He had murdered her parents and orchestrated Anna's death, and he would not hesitate to add Helena and her child to his list of casualties if they posed a threat to his continuing operations. But as Helena stood in that sterile surgical suite, surrounded by the instruments of Barrett's manipulation, she felt something shift in her understanding of what it meant to fight for the people she loved. Her parents had died trying to expose Project Genesis through conventional means, gathering evidence and building cases that could be presented to authorities who might or might not have the power to bring justice. Anna had died trying to escape with her lover and child, attempting to outrun a legacy that had ultimately proven faster and more relentless than love. Helena was not going to repeat their mistakes. "All right," she said, reaching for the consent form with apparent resignation. "I'll sign your document, but I want to read it thoroughly first. If I'm consenting to procedures that could affect my child's entire future, I need to understand exactly what I'm agreeing to." Barrett nodded approvingly, clearly believing that Helena had accepted the inevitability of his victory. "Of course. Take all the time you need to review the terms." Helena moved to the examination table and spread the consent form across its surface, bending over the document as if she were studying its contents with the care of someone making the most important decision of her life. In reality, she was positioning herself to reach the emergency call button that she had noticed mounted on the wall beside the examination table, a device designed to summon immediate assistance in case of medical emergencies. As Barrett and Dr. Whitmore watched her apparent capitulation with satisfaction, Helena pressed the emergency button with her elbow while pretending to read the fine print of the consent form. She knew that triggering the alarm would bring security personnel and medical staff rushing to the surgical suite, creating enough chaos to provide her with an opportunity to escape, or at least to complicate Barrett's carefully orchestrated plan. The alarm that began wailing throughout the clinic was louder and more persistent than Helena had expected, a sound designed to cut through any other activity and demand immediate attention from everyone in the building. Barrett's expression shifted, from satisfaction to alarm as he realized that Helena had outmaneuvered him, and Dr. Whitmore moved toward the examination table with obvious intent to restrain her before she could escape. Helena was ready for them. The months of pregnancy had not diminished her agility or her determination to protect herself and her child, and she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned early that survival often depended on the ability to fight when fighting seemed impossible. She grabbed a metal instrument tray from the examination table and hurled it at Dr. Whitmore's head, the impact sending him stumbling backward into a cart filled with surgical equipment. The crash of metal against metal added to the chaos created by the still wailing alarm, and Helena used the distraction to dart toward the door of the surgical suite. Barrett moved to intercept her, but Helena had anticipated his attempt to block her escape. She feinted toward the main door and then pivoted toward a secondary exit that led to what appeared to be a storage area, forcing Barrett to choose between pursuing her and trying to silence the alarm that was bringing unwanted attention to his activities. Helena burst through the storage room door and found herself in a corridor lined with medical supplies and equipment. The emergency alarm was even louder here, echoing off the walls with an intensity that made it difficult to think clearly. She could hear voices and footsteps approaching from multiple directions as clinic staff responded to the alarm, and she realized that she had only moments to escape the building before Barrett regained control of the situation. The corridor led to a service elevator that Helena hoped would take her to the building's ground floor. But as she reached for the call button, she heard Barrett's voice behind her, closer than she had expected, and filled with a fury that made her blood freeze. "Miss Moore," he called, his cultured tone replaced by something far more dangerous. "You're making a very serious mistake. The complications we've detected are real, and every moment you delay treatment increases the risk to your child's life." Helena turned to face him, noting that he was alone, and that Dr. Whitmore was apparently still dealing with the aftermath of his collision with the surgical equipment. Barrett looked less composed than she had ever seen him, his carefully maintained facade of professional concern replaced by the predatory intensity of a man whose plans had been disrupted. "The only mistake I'm making," Helena replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline racing through her system, "is believing that you're capable of telling the truth about anything." Barrett's smile was cold and utterly devoid of warmth. "Perhaps you're right about the medical complications, Miss Moore, but you're quite wrong if you think that escaping this clinic will solve your problems. I've been planning this confrontation for months, and your heroic gesture has only delayed the inevitable." The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Helena stepped inside while keeping her eyes fixed on Barrett. She could see in his expression that he was telling the truth about having contingency plans, but she also saw something that gave her hope. Barrett was angry, and angry people made mistakes that careful planners could exploit. "Augustus will find me," she said as the elevator doors began to close. "And when he does, he'll make sure that you pay for everything you've done to innocent people." Barrett's laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, my dear girl, Augustus is exactly where I want him to be, walking into a trap that will destroy everything he thinks he's built. By the time he realizes what's happening, you and your genetically enhanced baby will be safely under my control, and he'll be facing criminal charges that will end his career and his freedom." The elevator doors closed on Barrett's gloating expression, but Helena could still hear his voice echoing in her mind as the car descended toward the ground floor. Whatever trap Barrett had set for Augustus was apparently already in motion, and Helena's escape from the clinic had not prevented the larger catastrophe that was bearing down on them both. The elevator opened onto the clinic's elegant lobby, where Helena could see through the windows that police cars were arriving outside the building. The emergency alarm she had triggered had apparently brought more than just medical staff to investigate the disturbance, and Helena realized that Barrett's contingency plans might include having her arrested for causing a disturbance in a medical facility. She needed to reach Augustus immediately, but her phone still showed no signal, suggesting that Barrett's jamming device was affecting the entire building. Helena looked around the lobby and spotted a landline telephone at the reception desk, but approaching it would require her to cross an open space where she would be visible to anyone entering the building. As Helena weighed her options, the lobby doors opened and two police officers entered, their expressions suggesting that they were responding to a serious incident rather than a routine alarm. Behind them came a third figure that Helena recognized with a mixture of relief and terror. Augustus, his face grim with the kind of controlled fury that suggested he had finally understood the scope of Barrett's manipulation. "Helena," Augustus called across the lobby, his voice carrying a combination of relief and desperation that made her chest tighten with emotion. She ran to him without caring who might be watching, and when his arms closed around her, Helena felt some of the terror that had been driving her finally begin to recede. Augustus was here, which meant that Barrett's trap had not been entirely successful, and together they might still have a chance to escape the nightmare that had been constructed around them. "How did you know where to find me?" Helena asked as Augustus held her close enough that she could feel his heart beating against her chest. "Barrett made a mistake," Augustus replied, his voice rough with the kind of emotion that suggested he had been imagining the worst possible outcomes. He used his own contacts to arrange the fake medical emergency, and one of those contacts owed me a favor. When I realized what was happening, I called the police and came here as fast as I could. Helena pulled back slightly so she could look into Augustus's face, noting the lines of strain and exhaustion that suggested he had been pushing himself beyond reasonable limits. "Augustus, Barrett said that you were walking into a trap. He claimed that you would be facing criminal charges that would destroy your career and your freedom." Augustus's expression darkened, and Helena saw in his eyes the same cold calculation that had built his business empire. "Barrett has evidence linking me to Project Genesis activities that took place before I shut down the program. He's prepared to release that evidence to authorities and media outlets unless I cooperate with his demands." "What kind of demands?" Helena asked, though she suspected she already knew what Barrett wanted. "Complete control of our child's upbringing and genetic development," Augustus replied. "Barrett wants to continue his grandfather's work, using our son as his primary test subject. He's willing to destroy my reputation and send me to prison if that's what it takes to gain access to the genetically enhanced baby he helped create." Helena felt anger rise in her chest like molten metal, burning away the last traces of fear that had been controlling her actions since she arrived at the clinic. Barrett's manipulation was even more comprehensive than she had realized, designed not just to trap her into consenting to additional genetic experiments, but to force Augustus into a position where he would have to choose between his freedom and their child's welfare. "Then we don't give him that choice," Helena said, her voice carrying a determination that seemed to surprise Augustus with its intensity. "We expose him first. We take everything we've learned about Project Genesis and Barrett's involvement in continuing genetic experiments, and we make it public before he can use his evidence against you." Augustus stared at her as if she had suggested something impossible, his business instincts clearly warring with his desire to protect their family. "Helena, if we go public with accusations against Barrett, he'll retaliate by releasing evidence that could send me to prison for decades. Even if we ultimately prove that he's guilty of worse crimes, the damage to our family would be irreversible." "And if we don't go public," Helena replied, "Barrett will control our son's entire life, using him as a test subject for genetic experiments that could kill him or turn him into something that's no longer human. Augustus, some risks are worth taking if the alternative is unacceptable." Augustus looked at the woman who had somehow become the strongest person he had ever known, and felt the last of his resistance crumble under the force of her logic and courage. Helena was right. They could not allow Barrett to continue his manipulation indefinitely, could not raise their child in the shadow of threats and blackmail that would eventually destroy their family, just as they had destroyed so many others. "All right," Augustus said, his voice carrying the finality of a man who had made a decision that would change everything. "We fight back. But Helena, once we start down this path, there's no retreat. Barrett will throw everything he has at us, and we'll need to be prepared for a war that could cost us everything we've built together." Helena smiled, and Augustus saw in her expression the same fearless determination that had driven her to trigger the clinic's emergency alarm and escape from Barrett's trap. "Augustus," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him with a passion that tasted like victory and defiance, "everything we've built together is worth fighting for, and I'd rather lose it all fighting for our family than live as prisoners in Barrett's genetic laboratory." The police officers who had been waiting patiently for their conversation to conclude finally approached, and Augustus saw in their expressions the kind of professional skepticism that suggested Barrett had already begun his campaign to discredit them. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Augustus felt ready for whatever Barrett might throw at them. With Helena at his side, he was no longer the isolated, emotionally armored man who had been vulnerable to Barrett's manipulation. He was part of something larger and stronger than himself, part of a family that was worth any sacrifice necessary to protect it. The final battle with Daniel Barrett was about to begin, and Augustus Blackwood was no longer afraid of the outcome. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for if necessary, and no amount of evidence or blackmail could change the fundamental truth that love was stronger than the forces arrayed against it. 3 months later, Helena stood in the nursery they had prepared in the east wing of Thornfield Manor, holding their son and watching the morning sun stream through windows that had been specially installed to provide optimal light for a child whose genetic enhancements had made him more sensitive to environmental factors than normal babies. James Edward Blackwood had been born healthy and perfect, despite the genetic modifications that had been performed without his parents' consent. The additional procedures that Barrett had wanted to conduct had proven unnecessary, as the baby's enhanced genetics had stabilized naturally during the final months of pregnancy. He was everything Helena and Augustus had hoped for and more: intelligent, alert, and possessed of a vitality that seemed to light up every room he entered. Barrett himself was facing trial for murder, genetic manipulation, and conspiracy charges that would ensure he spent the remainder of his life in prison. The evidence that Augustus and Helena had gathered, combined with testimony from other victims of Project Genesis experiments, had built a case so comprehensive that Barrett's lawyers had advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than risk a jury trial that would certainly result in multiple life sentences. The scandal had destroyed Augustus's business empire, exactly as Barrett had threatened. Blackwood Biotech had been dissolved, its assets seized to compensate victims of genetic experiments that stretched back decades. Augustus had been cleared of criminal charges after cooperating fully with authorities, but his reputation in the biotechnology industry was permanently damaged. Helena found that she didn't care about the loss of wealth or social standing. Augustus had retained enough assets to ensure their financial security, and they had discovered that happiness had very little to do with the size of their bank account or the scope of their business interests. What mattered was the family they had built together, the love that had survived every attempt to destroy it, and the knowledge that their son would grow up free of the genetic manipulation that had claimed so many other innocent victims. "He's going to be extraordinary," Augustus said from the doorway, his voice soft with the kind of wonder that had become commonplace since James's birth. Helena turned to smile at the man who had become everything she had never dared to hope for: partner, protector, and the kind of father who would move mountains to ensure his child's happiness. Augustus had been transformed by their experiences together, evolving from the emotionally distant businessman she had first met into someone who understood that the most important victories in life could not be measured in profit margins or market share. "He already is extraordinary," Helena replied, looking down at their son's perfect face and feeling the kind of contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Outside the nursery windows, the gardens of Thornfield Manor were beginning to show the first signs of spring, with new growth emerging from soil that had been dormant throughout the long winter months. It seemed fitting that their son's first glimpse of the world beyond the manor's walls would be of a landscape that was being reborn, fresh and clean and full of possibilities. Helena Moore Blackwood had learned that love was not a weakness to be avoided, but the strongest force in the universe, capable of surviving any trial and overcoming any enemy. She had found her place in the world, not as a victim of other people's manipulations, but as a woman who was willing to fight for what mattered most. And as she stood in the morning sunlight, holding the child who represented the future she and Augustus had built together, Helena knew that their story was not ending but beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as partners and equals and lovers who had learned that some things were worth any sacrifice necessary to protect them. The dark legacy of the Blackwood family had finally been laid to rest, replaced by something bright and hopeful and infinitely precious. Love had triumphed over manipulation, trust had conquered fear, and the future stretched ahead of them like an open road leading toward adventures they would share as a family. In the end, Helena thought, as she watched Augustus reach for their son with hands that trembled with tenderness, the greatest victory was not in defeating their enemies, but in creating something beautiful enough to make all their struggles worthwhile. And as James Edward Blackwood opened his genetically enhanced eyes and looked up at his parents, With an intelligence that already seemed to understand the love that surrounded him, Helena knew that their story had found its perfect ending in the promise of new beginnings.